So the papers I've set out are some examples of what you can make with the pulps that we're doing today. Cooked some iris leaves, and we're going to break them up in the blender, and then you can mix them with another pulp. I have some white scraps of paper that I've also blended up, and these are just some different things with the iris leaf paper. In this case, I've embedded a piece of cheesecloth and some fabric inside between layers, and you'll see that later on how that's done. This is just a paper that is a combination of the white paper that I recycled and the iris leaves that have been cooked and prepped prior to adding them to the vat. Now this one that I started out with that I was showing you is a mixture of different pulps, and there's a technique called pulp painting. And so this is an example of pulp painting with black dyed pulp that I had. This particular sheet is made from abaca, which is related to the banana, and it likes tropical property, so I don't get it around here. So we'll go out to the barn next, which is where I have my paper making studio, and you'll see the whole process from the beginning to the end. Here is where I cook my fibers that I'm going to make paper out of, just because it gets, kind of smelling, and sometimes I have to do it for several hours. Iris leaves only take about an hour once you get it boiling, and I cook it in washing soda, which you can get at the store in the soap section. And what I did is I chopped up the iris leaves into small, like 1 to 2 inch lengths. And this is really so that when we get ready to use them in the blender, they're not going to get all tangled around the blades. And this is the kind of iris that you see around that people have. They're called bearded iris. And so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put them over the strainers to get rid of what they were cooking in. And the reason we cook it is to break down, there's lignin holding the cellulose fibers together, and so you want it so that you can see how easy it peels apart now, whereas if it were just cut down outside, it wouldn't be peeling apart this easily. So the soap helps break it down. And so next I'm going to put it over the strainers, and so that it takes a little bit of the weight off it, I'm just going to use something here to help me. I just take my 1 gallon water jugs and I cut the tops off. And notice that the fluid is a dark color, and that's called a liquor. It's not really liquor, but it's plant liquor. So what we want to do is we want to rinse it until that liquor is clear. People that dye fabrics and things, sometimes they leave the color in the plant fiber because that would dye, a nice dark color. But I want the paper to be archival, which means acid-free. So if you rinse it, then it makes the paper last longer, like lots and lots, really long. Because you look at books that are from a long time ago, 1600s and so forth, that paper was made from rags, linen or cotton rags, and also from hemp fibers. As the early paper makers, they discovered, because they had their sails were made out of, and their ships were made out of that hemp and sisal fibers. And so they discovered that it made really great paper too. And so they did harvested it and cooked it and rinsed it and made it into paper. And this is before they started using the cotton rags and linen rags. And then later on, much later on, they discovered, they would make paper out of wood pulp. But making paper out of plant fibers is much more sustainable than making paper out of wood pulp. You don't have to cut down a tree, and lots of these plants just grow more. I'm just going to leave that bucket there, and I'll come and get that later. But we're going to take this in the studio now, and we're going to rinse it. Okay, so now we're inside the studio, and I'm right here by my water supply, and I have the pulp that I cooked, and now I'm going to dump it in the pail. And now I'm going to release the pulp from the strainer and rinse it. So I just slosh it around, and it even starts to break down, see, already, without even putting it in the blender. I'm just swishing it around with my fingers like this. And then I'll just take pail, put this strainer on top of it again, and pour. And you can see already the water is a lot lighter. And I'll hold it up so you can see it draining. See, it's a light yellow now. So I only need to rinse it maybe a couple more times. So you just rinse it until most of it is clear. And you'll still get little bits of the gold fibers that the irises are, and that's fine, because you're not going to get it totally. And see, now the water is just a light color. You can see when I dump it, it's just a light color. And this is all non-toxic because I haven't added anything to it other than soap. And that soap is biodegradable. So it's fine to use. I only use stuff that's safe in this studio. So any plant fiber you could do this with. And some is going to break down faster than others. Others might not break down as much. So you have to cook them longer. But this one works fine for about an hour. I think I might have gone over an hour a little bit with this, just because I wasn't paying attention. So you really can't go wrong. One thing about paper making is very friendly. You really can't make a mistake. It's like you learn something new each time you try something, which is really, really neat. And you can see how much it's breaking down already. I won't have to do too much in the blender. I'm going to dump this out. And dump that out. And this probably is going to be the last rinse, as it's getting lighter and lighter. So strain it, and then we'll bring a handful over to the blender. Okay, So you can see it's rinsing, it's clear now, so I know it's safe. I mean, it's safe, it's just, it will last longer as a sheet of paper if you rinse it until it comes clear. Okay, so I'm gonna get the blender over here. So you don't want to take too much. I would say one small handful. You can always add more if you find that that doesn't clog your blender when you're blending. You can add, you know, a little bit more. See how I just kind of let it swirl around. And you want to make sure you put the top on this. And I just use the pulse feature. I don't use any of these others. I just pulse it. So I'm pulsing. And then I'm going to check it to see how it is. And see how already, I mean, this might make a pretty larger fibered piece. So you could stop at this point and take a sheet of paper just to kind of see what it looks like. We'll break it down just a little bit more. Okay, and then I'm going to take this over to my vat. I have about 3 or 4 blenders full here of water and iris broken down. So it's still too much fiber to make a sheet with or be too clumpy. So I'm adding water to the vat. And I just swish it around with my fingers. And the other thing is it needs to be a little deeper for me to be able to get down in there and make a sheet of paper. So that's looking about right now. Now I have a couple different kinds of mold and decals. Called a Western mold and decal, patterned after the early mold and decals that the early Americans and Europeans made, although with more modern materials. We made these ourselves just with molding strips from the hardware store, and then the screening you could just staple on some window screening, but what I have here is some heat shrinking poly screening that I got from a paper supplier, and I then just glue it, or it could be stapled onto the frame, and then it's heat shrunk, and so it's nice and firm. Now you can make your own also another way with simple materials you get at the grocery store. These are those foam containers, and this is the other foam container that I made into the bottom part, which is the mold. So that's the mold. And this is the top part, which is the decal. Okay, so I labeled top on these because when I put my tape on, it was just slightly more one way than the other. But if you just trace what you do, and I just made little pin pricks to trace, you know, where my opening was, so that I knew where to cut my hole for my decal. And this is just window screening, and this is just duct tape to hold it all on. Now you don't have to wrap it this solidly, but you know, you can if you want. And then you just put it together, swish your solution, and then you go down and lift up. And then you just get rid of the excess. So this is a long fibered pulp, obviously. So you can either turn these over into the frame, or or you can just pick them off. It's up to you. And then I lift it carefully, and I have to be careful because I don't want it to pull all my fibers off. But if it does, you just do another one. It's really, you know, it's something that's... Now, even just not adding anything, this iris leaves in water, you get a piece of paper. Take this now over to the table where I will cooch. I will cooch the fiber onto a board. And it's good to start with two, they're called felts, but they're really just blanket material that's cut up. So you could use, again, things you have around the house. And these have to be wet. Otherwise, the pulp won't stick to the cloth. And then we're going to press these after we build up what's called a post. Then I press in here to release, and there we go. Sometimes it's a little tricky with the plain iris fibers. See, there's a little bit of a hole here. So I'm going to show you what, I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit and show you what we can do. We can either pull another sheet, laminate it on top of that, or I can go to my white paper pulp that was made from recycled paper. So what I did is I saved my scraps from my artwork that I do, the drawings and little books that I make, and soak the paper scraps and then put them in the blender just like we did for the iris. And so I'm just going to make a little sandwich with the white underneath or on top, whichever way you want to look at it. By keeping the decal on, it helps you keep a rectangular edge. But you can also let there be a little bit of a deckled edge all around if you want. And then I just center this over my iris leaf and laminate the two papers together. Whoops. Now when that happens, it's not a big deal. You just put it back down, and I have some more paper pulp in a squeeze bottle. And so what I do is I just fill in the hole. It's the same thing. It's this pulp with water in a little jar. They're like ketchup bottles. You can get them, they're clear. So that'll look kind of nice. It'll have two different sides to it. It'll have a white side and it'll have the texture side from the iris leaf. And then again, another wet felt. And again, these are blankets that have been... Okay, so I jumped ahead a little bit to talk about the white paper. And I'm going to just show you what those scraps look like before I beat them up. So they were just little pieces of 100% cotton rag paper that I had left over from, I make these triangle books. And so they were, I had lots of them. So I did that. And then I soaked them. And soaking them, they got very soft. So if you are making paper from 100% cotton rag papers, it's a good idea to soak it before you put it in the blender. But if you're using junk mail, then that paper's very thin. You can just go ahead and just put it right in the blender after you take the blender. And I have taken the scraps. And again, just a handful. You don't want to wear down your blender. And it's a good idea to not use your kitchen blender, but to have one that's just going to be for experiments and paper making. I'm going to pulse it just like I did with the iris leaves. And you can see them starting to break up. See how it's getting cloudy, kind of cottage cheesy yet. So there's a few pieces in it, but again, if you added little bits of a junk mail that had interesting colors or text on them, that could be an interesting thing. Or bits of maps, and even some iris leaves that was left in the blender. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix this with the iris that I've got over here. And you'll see that by adding a little bit of the white paper, it does lighten up the color, but it makes the paper more flexible, so you won't get it breaking like that one did. Now I should technically wash this, but since it's the same fiber, it's white, that same white that's in this, I'm going to go ahead and just make a sheet. Now I'm going to show you also, you can make a sheet without the decal, especially when you've got a long fibered pulp. So I just go in and just take your fingers and put the excess pulp back in. This I'm going to leave because it's kind of a neat edge. I'm just going to put it right there, leave it just like that. So then we'll bring it over here. Watch your step. And this is called couching. Press down. Good. And this time it didn't break on me. Okay, so you see, just mixing a little bit of your junk mail or a little bit of the 100% cotton rag in there, it just made it a lot more flexible, so it didn't break as much. I could even add this if I wanted to at this point. I could, and it would stick. So now I'm going to cover it up with a felt. Now I'm alternating with wool felt on this one, just so that when I peel it off, it's going to want to stick to the wool than this one, which is a mixture of synthetic fibers and cotton. I'm going to just put another felt on top to put my next one down. So another pulp that I mixed up is called Kozo, and that was also cooked and rinsed, and in this case I also pounded it with a pounder, a mallet. And then if you look closely, it's really hard to see the fibers, they're so fine. So this is a nice fiber I like to use when I'm laminating. If I say want to pull a sheet with the white, and then I want to put a plant on top of it, and then I want to lay a layer that's really translucent over it, I like to use the Kozo for that. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate that next, which I'll take the mold and the decal, and this is relatively clean, so I'm going to use it. Sorry. I stir up the pulp and then go down towards you and up, forward, sideways. The reason you're doing this is so that the fibers will mesh. I'll just show you what I mean with my fingers. So this gets the fibers going in all different directions. So it's nice because unlike some purchased papers, there's no grain direction. So it folds really easily if you're making note cards or something like that. So I take the decal off. I let it drain a little bit more in the vat. And then I'm going to come back over here and pooch onto the surface. Press, press, slip up. I want to put a plant on there, so over here I have some different plants that I have pressed. I have wet fingers, so I just tap my finger on. This is called Nigelia, and it's, or another name for it is Love in the Mist. And I have some thyme here, so I'm going to just make a little design with the two. And so you pick your plants when they're blooming, and then I just put them in a telephone book, and I'll show you that in a little bit, in a little while. Put it on my paper. And you don't want to mess with this while it's in this stage, because it's still fairly fragile till it's dry. So once you put something down, it's a good idea to leave it. Now I'm going to pull a sheet of the Kozo paper that I was telling you about. Thin, so you can put the decal on if you think that it's kind of thin. I'll try it first without and see if it is thick enough. I should do it this way so you can see. Yeah, that's thick enough. See how thin it is though?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So we'll go over here. And usually there's dents left in the felts where the last time you put your mold and decal down, so you can register it pretty easily. So you can see the Kozo has that kind of a goldish color, and the little flecks are the black bark. So Kozo, you're using the inner bark of the plant. And that's also very sustainable because it grows fast, like willow does. And you harvest the inner bark, cook it, rinse it, and so forth, just like the iris leaf. Okay, so then I go ahead and cover it up. I'm going to show you one more style of mold and decal, and then we'll make a bunch of sheets that you can see the different variations. So the next style I'm going to show you is great for pulp painting, and that is the decal box. This is was begun in Nepal, so it's also called the Nepalese mold. And this is homemade, as you can tell. There's a deep box without a top or bottom, and then this is just your basic window screening with decal, with the edges with duct tape, and then some thicker screening that you can get again at the hardware store in the window department, in the lighting department. So that goes on top of fluorescent lights. And then there's a little bit of a ledge in here for holding that, and that's just made with a quarter round that you can get at the hardware store or the lumber yard. So then you just put all these things together, and the rubber bands hold it together. But when you have it down submerged in the water, what you're going to do is you're going to keep it submerged till you're ready to lift it, and then when you lift it, you get your fingers all the way underneath it so these two parts don't separate. Otherwise your work all goes into the water. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to collect my pulps. Right now I just have a couple choices, but I also have all these colors. This is Abaca pulp that I have dyed different colors. So we can paint with that. We can also drop pieces of smaller plants in that are, you know, trickier to put on one at a time. So I just grabbed some pulp with, again, recycling. You can use yogurt or cottage cheese containers. And I get about 3 because the pulps are pretty thin. And then I'll check to see if I need any more. But I have all these colors too, so I can use these. Some of the colors were left over from my last workshop. This is a gray color that's quite nice. That'll go well with, and these are just the squeeze bottles that I've used before. And these other colors are all colors that were dyed, Abaca dyed. The different colors. What you're gonna, oh, one more thing. I have plants over here. You can stay right there if you want. I'll bring them over. So these were pressed, dried and pressed prior to working with them. And since it will be awkward to pick them up with my fingers because they'll want to stick to my fingers, I could use a tweezer, or I could just shake them in if I didn't care. Okay. So you start with whatever color. I might start with my iris. I'm going to stir it back up again and pour it in. And got a piece of fiber here I don't want, so I'm just going to take it out. And now I can take some of these and poke them down in the base fiber. And you'll have a sheet that's different on each side, so it'll be a two-sided sheet. And they kind of want to go where they want to go, so you have to kind of be alright with that. But this type of mold and decal was what I started out with before I had a studio to do papermaking in. I had this because then you didn't have to have all these vats. You just have one setup and then have everything else in pails or smaller containers. Just going to put a few more in, and then I'm going to pour some more colors. And you can be as you know, many or as few colors as you want. The idea is you want to cover up the screen, so I'm going to just push it down in. I'll put a little bit, maybe I'll put a little bit of a bright color in there. But see how the brighter color, I'm just letting it diffuse in. I'm not like putting it with the container. Okay. Try this yet. Now at some point, if you don't want your design to change, if you want to keep it the way it is, what you can do is carefully pull it up and get your fingers all the way down. And then what you can do is you can move things around if they're not buried. Like these are kind of buried, so I wouldn't want to move those. But I'm going to put this up here. And those are fine. Maybe put another another couple in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my turkey baster. I'm going to grab some more of the translucent pulp. And now I'm just going to go over those plants that were just put on. The ones that were there before that had pulp on them, no problem. But if they don't have pulp on them, they're going to fall off when you coat your paper. So you want to make sure that everything has pulp on it. I usually also go over the edge again because sometimes we forget to do that. And so that makes the papers stronger too. Okay, so you can kind of see what you're getting. That looks like it needs a little more, so I'm just gonna put a little bit more on that. Now this sheet is pretty thin, but there's no screen showing for the most part, so it's okay to take the rubber bands off, lift the decal box, and see it. And it will be pretty translucent too, you can see against the light. I don't know if it's bouncing up. You'll see it better once it's dry. But. Okay, so then you're going to come back over here and you're going to tip it upside down and press it. Then you look and see where it's lifting away from the paper, and this is where it is right here. So that's the corner I start with. So I'm going to take the papers that we just made and put them in the press. And this is a homemade press, as you can probably tell. Pretty simple construction, just boards that have been polyurethane. If you have access to marine varnish, that's a great material to use, because that helps to keep them water resistant longer. I'm just going to fill that space up with boards, and then I'm going to put my little jack in. This is a car jack. You can get these in the hardware store too. It's just a 2-ton one because it's for a small press. And then I'm going to put boards on top. Fit one more spinning. Maybe not. Okay, so what I do is there's this little adjustment that you can do right here, that you can screw it higher, so that way you don't have as much surface area to do. And then I just do it until I can't do it any longer. If you're a really strong person, then just back off a little bit, because you don't want to break your press. So right now we're getting lots of water over here. You can see all the water coming out. And pressing helps strengthen the paper and bond the fibers together. But if you don't have a press that you've made or purchased, you can just stand on the boards if you're careful and don't teeter around. If somebody hold on to you, you can stand on the boards. Just don't press as many papers at a time. Now I'm going to release it, and I'm going to flip the whole post over. So now I'm just removing the boards. So now I just take it and flip it. If it's too heavy for you to flip, just do it one way. But if you're pressing it with your feet, I would just do a few papers at a time, and then you know, press it that way. Now the water has made a little bit more room, so I might add an extra board to however many I had before. Make sure the bottom is tight and the top is notched in and centered over your boards. Now just a little bit of water. So we've got most of it. Okay, I'm going to loosen it, left, press down and bring it out. I always tighten it back up before I put it away, just to be sure that. And now we're going to lay it out on boards to dry. Countertop material. Back when people used this instead of what they use nowadays with granite tops and so forth. So we want to wipe our surfaces off. They get dusty just sitting around, or they might have had paper on them before and not been washed off. So here's the first one. This is the one in the video that I showed you was kind of broken because we just made it out of the iris alone without anything else in it, and then I laid the white paper on top of it, and you can see it's pretty strong with that white paper. And the white paper was made from the 100% cotton rag scraps of paper that I had put in the blender and pulped up. So I'm taking the roller and just making sure that all the air bubbles are out and that it's sealed on the surface of, and now this is the iris one that has a little bit of pulp from the white paper mixed with it. It doesn't want to roll. There it is. So you can see how translucent that is. And later you can peel them off the board when they're dry, and you'll see that how translucent it is. Once again, lay this down and make sure that it's on the board. It's called restrict drying, so that when it dries it stays nice and flat instead of puckering all up. And oh, one more of mine, and then you'll have Mary Beth's. And you can see how translucent this one is. It's really translucent. And these felts I can just put in the washing machine because they're blanket material. So here's the first one. This is the one in the video that I showed you was kind of broken because we just made it out of the iris alone without anything else in it. And then I laid the white paper on top of it. And you can see it's pretty strong with that white paper. And the white paper was made from the 100% cotton rag scraps of paper that I had put in the blender and pulped up. So I'm taking the roller and just making sure that all the air bubbles are out and that it's sealed on the surface of, and now this is the iris one that has a little bit of pulp from the white paper mixed with it. It doesn't want to roll. There it is. So you can see how translucent that is. And later you can peel them off the board when they're dry and you'll see that how translucent it is. Once again, lay this down and make sure that it's on the board. It's called restrict drying, so that when it dries it stays nice and flat instead of puckering all up. And oh, one more of mine, and then you'll have Mary Beth's. And you can see how translucent this one is. It's really translucent. And these felts I can just put in the washing machine because they're blanket material. I think next is Mary Beth's. So I'll put this to the side and we'll get Mary Beth's papers out. Oh, that's pretty, Mary Beth.
Thank you.
Can't see the red on it because it's on a red background, but that came out really nice. Here's another really translucent one. So the side that's toward the board will be a little bit smoother. this is nice and dramatic. That came out nicely too. Came out nicely.
Thank you.
Is that it? Nope, one more. If you don't have a brayer, you can use a rolling pin. That's why I brought it over here for that purpose. When they're dry, I would say overnight, maybe later tomorrow. You should be able to peel them off. And what you do is you see if there's an edge that looks like a good strong edge, like this is a good strong edge, this is a good strong edge. And you can slide a little razor blade under it just to lift it up. But sometimes if you've got fingernails, you can just slip your fingernail under there and peel them right off.